Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, that's great. So today we will talk about the CSS methodologies, and today's lecture will be short as well as the previous one. So we will talk mostly not about the techniques or the syntax of HTML or CSS or anything like that. Instead, we will talk about good practices that are not required to use, but it is recommended that we use them in order for our colleagues to read your code easily and understand it easily. The agenda for this lecture is the following. So we will talk in general about methodologies, what they are and how we can use them. We can talk about CSS architecture, separation of concerns, different methodologies like BEM or object-oriented CSS or others in brief. And we will also talk about the content-agnostic CSS and utility classes and what this means. As I already told you, when we write code, it's not only required to write code that works properly in the browser, but it is also recommended that we write clean, beautiful, and understandable code that our colleagues will easily read and understand. So our browsers and end users, they don't really need that you write your code in a clean way. But your colleagues, they really need it because they will work with it and they need to understand it and work with it. So if you work on a large project, it can often become a mess because you will read some code that is written by your colleagues and you don't understand something and you think that you fix, for example, one bug, and instead of getting a working app, you will receive a couple of bugs instead. So you you can fix something and get more errors because you haven't noticed something or haven't understood something that your colleagues have done before. This is why we try to read a clean and understandable code. These are the general rules that we are like the general goals that we try to achieve while we write the CSS code. So we try to reduce the number of styling rules, styling collisions. We try to avoid big nesting, like high-level nesting like multi-level nesting of CSS selectors. We try to reach the maintainability of our code, so it would be easier to read and understand by new team members. We want our collaboration between team members to be fast, and we want to have smoother project handoffs. So these are the main points that we try to highlight here. There is such thing as separation of concerns. So sometimes we write code in this way when CSS, HTML, JavaScript share functionality between each other, and it is not separated. So clean code should look like this, because we have different technologies for different purposes, and we have our HTML for creating the page structure. So here we only list our elements. CSS should only be responsible for the presentation, for how elements look like, and JavaScript should only be responsible for the behavior. So that's why we don't write styles inside HTML elements, such as inline styles or something like this. We specify what our elements, for example, if we use images, we try to identify what their purposes are. So if they are used only for presentation, then probably we have to put them into the CSS as background images, or as after or before pseudo elements, something like this. Or if these images are important, so they are a part of a content. For example, if you're selling something online, you should probably put the images of your products into the main page as an IMG element and write an alternative text. So this these elements would be seen by all users independently of whether their CSS styles are loaded or not, or for example, if they cannot reach these elements on the screen, or maybe they are using screen readers, so that these elements are accessible for every user. So if the image is a part of a content, it should be put into the HTML file, or if it's just a presentational image or a background image, so it should be put into the CSS file. So that's how we define what this particular element or what this particular piece of code does, and we put it into how to say, into a separate into a specific file and use it within a specific technology. So here, as I said, we try to identify whether it goes to HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. So this is what the separation of concerns is. And for example, here, if we go deeper into what the separation of concerns is, we claim that as I said, your HTML should only contain information about your content, and styling, all styling decisions should be made in the CSS. So, for example, if we try to style this element, so we create a paragraph with a class of text center and give it some text. I don't know, in this case, this text says hello there. And this is a bad practice. because our HTML it doesn't have to know anything about our styling. So if we put it here, this type of text, we are tied to this text being centered. So, okay, we put into the styling, we style it as a centered element. So it has the text align property defined as center. The problem here is when, for example, your designer comes to you and says that they don't want this element to be centered anymore. They want it to be sent to the left-hand side of the page. So it shouldn't be centered anymore. It should be located like here. And you don't have to you have to not only change this CSS rule, you have to change the class name, and you have to go to the HTML and change the class name everywhere this text center is written. So this is what creates additional problems when you work with this code. So for example, if you even forget, for example, you change this property, so you put text align, for example, left or right, and you forget to change the class name, it can create additional problems. So when your colleagues read your code and they see the text center class, and they just don't understand what this means because it's not centered. Instead, the good practice is to give a descriptive name for the text. For example, here it is greeting, greeting, hello there. Okay, and inside the CSS file, you can style it as you want. So you can align it as centered or right or left, or doesn't matter. You won't have to change your class name here. Okay, so sometimes people style elements with tags, which is also kind of a bad idea because there can be lots of images or div elements or h2 elements inside within the page. And another downside is that, for example, you can define this element as h2, but you later you change the structure of your page, and this element won't be h2 anymore, so it will be h3. So you have to change it here as well. So it's a better practice if you give classes to all the elements and work with classes. So the main point is that your HTML shouldn't know anything about your CSS, like here, and the other way around. So your CSS doesn't have to know anything about your HTML. So here, for example, here we can see a better structure. So it is less dependent on the HTML, and we can work with it more easily. Sometimes we have similar components on a page. For example, we have two similar components with a similar structure. So here we have a div with image with another div, h2 and paragraph. And here the structure is completely the same, but it is a different element. So they look the same, but their purpose on a page and their their content, so what goes inside, is different. So how should we behave in this way? Of course, we can duplicate the style and write some styles for the company info and all its elements, and write completely the same styles for the article preview. So we duplicate the styles from here to here. It will the downside of this principle is that we will break the DRI principle. I'm not sure if you have heard about it. The dry principle means don't repeat yourself. So you have to write the code that has already been written, and which is not good. So probably we should consider other options. We can also use the add extend construction, which will duplicate, which will do the same thing under the hood. So we take styles from the author bio, for example, class, and put it, apply these styles to article preview. However, this approach is also considered a bad practice and is not recommended for using. Other options are creating a content-agnostic component. What does it mean? It means that if from a design perspective, these two components are identical, then probably we can create this a common class that we put that we reuse through these components. So we give both elements the class of media card. So if we return back, so this would be a media card, and this would be media card as well. And we can write styles for this element only for one time. This approach is better, but there are some differences. There can be differences between these components, and we should also take them into account. So we should remember about them, and probably we should add more classes to these elements to extend these styles of media cards. So probably we should use some combination of classes, not only a single class for each component. And this is what we'll discuss later. So we will talk about the BAM methodology, and it takes this approach and extends it so we can modify our classes more easily and work with them and reuse them as well. There is also an approach of utility classes. Probably if you have used such libraries as Bootstrap that have some predefined styles that we reuse in our project. For example, here we can see such combination, this weird combinations of symbols like PI2, PX4, border R. So right now we don't understand what this means. For example, we can predefine some properties. Like, for example, we define a class with BG purple, which means background purple, and it will only have the property of background that equals to purple. Or, for example, hover BG light purple. When we hover over this element, it will have the background of light purple. So this sometimes we can predefine some CSS rules and reuse them over our app. But if we write too much of them, like here, so it looks like we write inline styles. So if there are too many classes with these combinations, it doesn't make your code better. So it's not recommended to go too far with these styles. But as I said, there are some libraries that are widely used, like Bootstrap. So the styles that they have is pretty common and can be widely used. So it's like you can use them, but with accuracy. Okay, so before we go to the CSS methodologies, do you have any questions on why do we need different approaches, different methodologies?
I have a confused about the slide that tell we shouldn't use merge nesting selector, right?
Yeah, nesting selectors are okay, but it's not recommended that you use many nesting levels. So for readability, it's better to use only 2, maximum 3 levels of nesting, and you are tied to the tags. So, for example, if you style by class and you change something in your HTML, it doesn't affect your class. But if you had, for example, an H3 inside your element and it became, for example, an H4 or H2, so you change the HTML tag, the HTML structure, you should go to the CSS file and see which CSS rules were affected by that, and it requires a lot of additional work that you could avoid if you were using classes.
And I see a slide that tell the concept of separation of concern in not always used in the real routers. So there is impossible to apply that concept in the real life routers.
Yeah, and also if you use some modern frameworks like React or Angular when you write HTML inside JavaScript and you change your styles dynamically, then probably it's impossible to reach the total separation of concerns. So probably the perfect world does not exist, but you should separate your functionality as much as possible. So the HTML is responsible for the content, the CSS for the presentation, and the JavaScript for functionality.
Yeah, it's clear to me now.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so if you don't have any questions, let's talk about the methodologies. So there is no, it's written here that there is no one true way to write CSS. So it depends on the project and it depends on how the team on the project has decided that they will write their CSS. And technically, if you write your CSS code in any way, like even in the ways that we can see on the previous slides, so by tags or anything like this, it will work, of course. But sometimes we can use different approaches, different sets of rules, which are recommended to use if to make your colleagues' life easier and more comfortable. So we will mostly talk about the BEM methodology, and we will also take a brief look at the others, because this one is the one that is commonly used on our projects, and we will take a closer look at this one. But you can also find different materials on the other ones if you want to. So the BEM or BEM or block element modifier methodology is a common component-based approach to web development. So if we write our HTML code and later our CSS code, we try to divide our page structure into different components. And we try to see if each element on the page can be reused, or if an element can only be a part of another element and it can be reused in different places. And on the base of that, we define each element as a block element or modifier on the page. So this makes your code more scalable, more usable, more readable, and easier to use. So if we look at a page, we see that, for example, there can be a page header, or for example, there is a form with two inputs and a button, or there can be a navigation menu. So we try to define all of these parts of the page as either blocks or elements. So before we talk about what blocks and what elements and what modifiers are, I can say that we use classes as selectors here. So we don't use IDs, we don't use tags, we don't use any universal selectors, nested selectors, or anything like that. So we mostly work with classes. Why we don't use IDs is because the ID is a unique name for an HTML element, and it can be reused for any other element. We don't use tags because, as I told you, the HTML structure can be changed, and you don't want to do any additional work for that. So if you change HTML H1 for H3, you don't want to change it in the CSS as well. So we want our CSS to be the least independent on the HTML as possible. We don't use reset and normalize because their work they are responsible for other things such as resetting the default browser styles. We don't use the universal selector here because it's not a part of BAM, because you can use it for all elements on the page, but it's not a part of this methodology. We don't use nested selectors because they make our code less reusable and more difficult to work with. Although it's not prohibited to use them, but you shouldn't like go too far with them and not use them too much. And here we come to the basics of BAM. So as I said, it solves the following tasks as reusing the layout, moving some fragments from one part of the page to another, move the finished layout between projects, create more clean code, and it also helps with the debugging. It also is universal, so you can write these classes not only within plain CSS, but you can also use it in Sass or React code in class attributes. And if you work with preprocessors like Sass, it's very easy to work with because you can write one code, like one class within the other class. So, for example, I will show you that later. So, about the parts of class names. So we have such thing as a block. A block is a totally independent page component that can be reused in different parts of the page. So the block name describes its purpose. So it should answer the question, what is it? Menu, button, page header, some, I don't know, article or anything like this. It shouldn't reflect the state of the element. So it doesn't have to answer the question, what does it look like red, big, or etc. So here we see different examples. So for example, this class is called red text, and this class is called error. The error is better than red text because we are not tied to the word red here. Because if we want to make this text black, it's will be much more reusable than making it red and only red. Blocks can be nested inside any other blocks. So for example, the page header can be a separate block and can be called, for example, page header. And it can contain other blocks. So if we give to this element class of, for example, page header, so it will be a separate block. And for example, this form can be called login form. So it will be given this class, and it is a separate block because we can put this login form, take it away from header and put it, for example, here below the header. So this is some part of page that can be reused. For example, this login input, it cannot exist. It can only exist inside this form. So it cannot be taken and put somewhere here as a login input. So nobody will understand what this separate input is doing here. So why is it separated from the other inputs on the form? So it is only a part of the form. So it cannot be a separate block. Same for the tabs here. Same for the input here with the button. So this one is a separate block. This one is a separate block. The logo can be a separate block, and this form as well. So as I said, blocks can be moved around on a page, between pages, projects. They can be reused. So for example, you have a couple of different pages with the same header. So the header can be defined as a header block, and you write code for it, only the CSS code only in one place. So this is an example of how they can be reused. So one item and one item. This one is a block and this one is a block. And here we come to the definition of an element. So an element, this is one tab from the previous example, and all these tabs are elements of the navigation block. The element name should also describe its purpose. So as a block name, it doesn't answer the question what it looks like. So it also answers the question what it is. So it can be an item, a text, or anything like that. And when we write a class for this element, it will be the syntax is the following. It is block name to like a double underscore, like 1 and 2, and element name. So you can see the syntax here. So we have a form, probably this one, the login form example, or no, it would be a search form like this with an input and a search button. So we have a form. A search form is a block, and we have an input and a button. So we have a search form double underscore input as a part of the search form, and a button with a class of search form double underscore button. So neither this element nor this element cannot be reused separately from their parent element, which is the form. A couple of words about nesting. So elements can be nested inside each other, but there is this note about the syntax. Sorry. So an element is always part of a block, and it's not a part of another element. So it doesn't depend on what their relation with the form is. So they cannot be direct children from of the form. There can be other elements between them, but they are, as I said, part of a block. So for example, here you can see a wrong way of writing this, and we have a form, the class of search form, and we see a div search form content, and inside we see two elements of input. So the search form content is an element of the search form block, and inputs input and a button are placed inside. So you should not write search form double underscore content double underscore input, and same with button. Instead, you should write it like this. You write a block name, and here we see our elements. So we see a div with a class of search form double underscore content, and inside this element we can define input with class of search form double underscore input and search form double underscore button. So this syntax is right, while this one is wrong. So there is no three-level nesting between elements and blocks. So only a two-level. And all elements are children of a block, even if they are not direct children of this element. And another important rule is membership. So if an element is a part of a block, it shouldn't be used separately from this block. So if we have like a form, search form, the same one with input and button inside, you cannot put these elements that are placed inside the form and reuse it separately from the form. So if the form is closed, and the input goes below, so they can only be placed inside the form, both input and button. An element, not all blocks have elements, so you can use, for example, you can define these elements as separate blocks. If it's, for example, if this button is reused in some other places. So, for example, you have like, I don't know, a green colored button which is reused in different places of your page. It's probably better to create a separate block for this button. Same for input. And also there are some combinations of classes. So for example, this button, it can have two classes. It can be a separate block, and it can be an element of the search form block. So it will be, for example, button and search form double underscore button. And you can write different styles for this. So for example, for the button class, you can write styles that are related to its color, size, or font size, anything related to the text. And for example, for the search form _button class, you can define such styles as margins or alignment. So how this button behaves inside a form as its element. Okay, so before we move to modifiers, do you have any questions on differences between blocks and elements?
So can I say that block is for reusing and element is not for reusing?
Yeah, so elements can only be a part of blocks, and uh, uh, any HTML element can be defined as a separate block if it is reused, and it can also be an element of another block. So for example, like buttons which are reused, they can be defined as a separate button block, and at the same way they can be defined as an element of the form block. So there can be a combination.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, let's proceed. And we will talk about modifiers. So modifier is finally the word that describes what the HTML element looks like. So for example, for buttons, each button can be in different states. Like it can be hovered, it can be sorry, it can be disabled, or it can be, for example, styled in any way. And for example, here you can have two uh, identical buttons, but this one is, for example, red and this one is green, but all other styling is the same. So you can put different modifiers to them and uh, write different colors for these uh, these buttons in the modifier classes. And for example, if you have a menu of tabs, so these tabs have default styling, and this tab is current. So it is completely the same tab, but it has some different features. Like it doesn't have a border button, and it has it just has some, I don't know, it looks slightly differently. So we can define it as a modifier as well. So yeah, it's an entity that defines the appearance, state, or behavior of a block or an element. So it can be written to both block or element classes, and it there are different approaches of how the modifier name can be separated. So here it is suggested to separate it by a single underscore. Sometimes the double minus is used. So for example, let me show you. div block or double underscore element single underscore modifier, or the other way is it can also be written as block modifier if it doesn't have any elements. And the other options, let me separate this. Div so it can be a block and a modifier, and sometimes modifiers are written like this. So you can meet either this or this syntax. It depends on the project. So sometimes, for example, we can have a button with the class of button labeled like this. We go back to our presentation. Sometimes we can define a modifier as a key and a value. So here it's just one word, for example, like search form. Just a moment. So sometimes we can define a modifier as a Boolean. So for example, here we have a search form and the search form focused. So if a Boolean modifier is present, its value is assumed to be true. So here it's, for example, it's like button, it's written like this, search form button disabled. So for this type of button, we say we set the modifier of disabled to true, and the CSS property of disabled to true. So if a CSS property can be defined as a Boolean, like true or false, then it can be added as a modifier here. The key value syntax. It can be used when the modifier value is important. So, for example, we have a search form with a theme of islands. So theme can be a modifier and the value can be islands. We can have different themes in our CSS. For example, the color, different color styling or something like that. Or we can have a button with a size of M, which is a specific size. Or for example, we can set a size of L to a different value. And these properties are also written as modifiers. And another important thing is that a modifier cannot be used alone. So it can only duplicate, so it should duplicate the block or the block element name, and only then we write the same thing with the modifier. So for example, here we can see we write, we have a search form with a modifier of search form theme islands. So we write both the search form because it has some elements inside, and then we write the search form theme islands. So we don't write only search form theme islands, and inside we write elements for the search form. So we should always write the block name as well. And as I said, technique for we can this mix technique where our elements, our HTML elements, I mean, can be a separate block and an element of another block at the same time. So for example, here we have a block named header, and inside we have a search form, which is also an element of a header. So it's a search form and header double underscore search form. So it is mixed here. Okay, so before we take a look at other methodologies, do you have any questions?
Do we need to write PAM at the first time we write CSS, or we rebuild our CSS file to PAM?
I guess it's better to write BAM from the beginning. So when you write your HTML code, you can already think about its structure and how you can divide your HTML code into blocks and elements. So I guess it will help you to later write the CSS code.
Yeah.
And another thing that I wanted to show you is that if we use the SAS or less preprocessors, it's also very helpful. The BAM is very helpful because you can write, for example, you have, I don't know, a class of form, for example, input, and for example, you can write some styling for the form. I don't know, some width, height, anything like that. And inside this CSS rule, you can write an ampersand, double underscore input. And inside, you write all the styles for the form input. So this code, if you use the preprocessors, it will compile into this class. And it is also pretty helpful. So, same with modifiers. So you can easily divide your CSS rules into blocks and elements as well. Yeah.
I have another question. Because block is the purpose of using block is to reuse it. So in case we don't want to reuse the style, we just want to use that style only one time. So which thing you choose to
I don't know, you just give it a separate class and it will exist as a block. So
it can it mean that block can be reused or not.
Yeah, but elements cannot be reused in any way. Yeah. So it is only a part of another block. Okay, any other questions? Okay, then just a few words about other methodologies because they are not pretty common, and honestly, I haven't used them much, and I'm not sure if they are widely used. But you can, well, just a few words about them, and you can also take a look at their documentation if you want to. But just to be familiar with them and what methodologies exist and what information you should look for. So another methodology is the object-oriented CSS. It has two main ideas when this structure and design are separated, and as well as container and the content. So the container is what is the element that no, for example, like div element or anything like that, and the content is our text. This approach helps us reducing the amount of code by reusing it, but it has problems with support. So because the lots of elements are reused, sometimes you should add additional classes to the markup, and sometimes you can if you want to make one change, you have to make additional changes as well, which is not very helpful for us. Another methodology is scalable and modular architecture for CSS, or SMA CSS. Here,
Oh, sorry.
yeah.
This part is different from BAM, right?
Yeah. So it's these approaches are totally different from BAM. So OOCSS is different, and SMA CSS is different from the previous two. But we don't look at them very close because they are not widely used. We just tell you that they exist and what their main principle is, and you can search for the details in the internet and look closely by yourself. So another approach is SMA CSS, as I said. So the main goal of this approach is to reuse the amount of code and simplify code support, probably as the main goal of any CSS approach. It was created by Jonathan Snook, who suggested that we divide our style into 5 parts, which are the base, the layout, so the layout, the module part, the state, the theme, and the combination of these parts can be called as SMA CSS. So the base rules are the styles of the main elements like body, input, button, etc. So we can write these styles inside of the HTML text. So here we can use attributes or tags for styling. Sometimes we can use classes, but in general, in general we don't. We use tags. The layout rules for global elements like sizes, dimensions, etc. Here we can style our big blocks like header, footer, or the main element, or some sidebars. And here we can use IDs because these elements are mostly used just once. So for example, we have only one page hero on a page, and we can use an ID for that. There are also some modules. So these are the blocks, like blocks in BAM, that can be used in different places on a single page. Here, it's not recommended to use the tags and the IDs, because an ID cannot be reused and tags can affect other elements. There also are some state rules, like in the example of the button. So a button can be, for example, disabled or focused. And here we can even use the important rule, which is considered a bad practice in any other cases. And we can also have our theme rules. These are the styles that you can replace. For example, with I'm not sure if we can remember any example for this. For example, like we have a dark and a light theme on our website, and we can switch between them. So like a night mode and a day mode. So if we switch to the night mode, our website uses the dark theme, and it's more comfortable to navigate through it in the evening time. Another approach is called atomic CSS. And here we can create a separate class for each reusable property. For example, here you can see the margin top of 1 pixel. We can name it empty 1, or width of 200 pixels with W 200. And you with this approach, you can reuse some declaration, and it's can how to say it helps to create a lot of reusability between classes, but sometimes it can be hard to read. So the downside, the drawbacks, like the minuses of this approach, is that we also tie our styling to the HTML, while our HTML shouldn't know about our styling. So this is a great disadvantage of this approach. And the class names are sometimes hard to read, because if you read the MT10, you don't know, you should always remember what that means. And it's not very easy to read. So this approach is also not very common. Another approach is called the multi-layer. So as at some point it is similar to the SMA CSS. So we also have different parts of our styles, which are called layers. So we have a 0 layer, or another name is foundation. It is pretty similar to our normalize or reset documents. So this code is responsible for resetting browser styles. The base layer, which includes the styles of reusable elements like buttons, inputs, etc. Project layer, it includes modules and context. So we specify our styles depending on the client browser or the device that our users open our page with. And the cosmetic layer is it reuses the OO CSS style and some reusable classes. We have to always remember about the hierarchy of the layers and how they affect each other. So the order of the styles is very important, and so the first goes the base layer, then the project layer and the cosmetic layer. So here we are tied to this order. And the last one is called the flat hierarchy of selectors, utility styles, namespace components, or simply fun. And fun can be defined as an abbreviation or of this principle. So F stands for flat hierarchy of selectors. It's recommended to use classes, not neither tags nor IDs, to make our CSS structure just flat, or to make it have only one level. Utility styles. So here we can also have atomic styles, like W100 for with 100, or other combinations of letters like float right. So we can solve some typical reusable markup tasks. And the namespace components. So it's recommended to add namespaces, or to how to say, to create modules inside our CSS, so we can avoid or overlapping in class names. So for example, if we have a class of button, and for example, we have a button on one part of the page and we have another button in another module, we need to divide our our modules between each other if these buttons should look different. So for example, the button class in one part and the button class in another part should not overlap. So this approach poses a few requirements on the project, and it's just establishes the form of recording selectors and how they can be used, and it is mostly suitable for small projects that's where these rules can be enough. So probably I would say that, for example, in projects that are already separated into modules, like if you're using Angular or React, probably this approach can also be used. Sometimes it is used with combination with BAM. Here you can see some useful links about all these methodologies. Lots of links about BAM, about Bootstrap, as I told you, with reusable styles, reusable classes, about other CSS methodologies, style guides, and some material design elements. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, and that's all from my side for today. What is the best? I guess for me, BAM is the most comfortable thing to work with, and a lot of projects still use it, but mostly it depends on the project. So if you come to a team who already work with them with a specific methodology, you should follow it as well. But I guess BAM is probably the most popular and the most common. I cannot say that it is the best, but it is pretty common and widely used.
I see the word cascade, but don't fully understand what it's meaning. Like the slide you talk about fund methodology, there's say, let's see.
Cascade.
Avoid a cascade without the need. I don't know what's.
It's pretty much like in the BAM. So you don't have to write this CSS selector inside a CSS selector inside a CSS selector. You just give each element a class name and you style it by the class name.
So what's cascade made of?
And also you don't have to, if you use classes, you don't have to worry about the priority of styling. So if, for example, so cascade is, as you probably know, something that goes like stairs, like by priority. So for example, you have some elements that are styled by ID or others by class or others by tag. You have to think about how these styles will be prioritized. So the ID has more priority or the class has less priority, and you should always think about that. And if you flatten this combination, so you only have classes that have the same priority each, and you work with classes, and you don't have to worry about the priorities of your styles. So that's what is called flat. So you don't have different levels of priority in your styles.
So we can understand that cascade, like it want to talk about the reality when you use different selector.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And so to apply the BAM methodology to our project, like our homework, I think it's just like it take us to how to write a CSS class name.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, because I don't see how much different between the write and the random way with the methodology in the practical.
Yeah, it just helps you to structure your elements properly.
Yes.
So it's the classes are not written randomly, and yeah, so they become more structured. Any other questions? Okay, so probably if you don't have any questions, I guess that's it, and I will see you on Friday and wish you good luck as always with your home tasks, and not only with them. And yeah, thanks for coming here today and have a good evening.
Yeah, thanks for your lecture.
Thank you. Bye bye.